I caught a glimpse of movement near the boardwalk, and my heart pounded in a way I'd never felt before. The shape looked almost human at first, then it jerked upright with an impossible swiftness that made my breath stick in my throat. A surge of alarm overtook me, as though I'd wandered into a forbidden realm. My legs trembled, my pulse hammered, and I realized I was about to uncover a truth no one should ever witness. My name is Thomas Gallagher, and this happened back in 2009 in the Grand Prismatic Spring area of Yellowstone National Park. I arrived that morning with my friend Ray. He was all enthusiasm, talking about how we needed fresh air and a dash of adventure. He nudged me on the shoulder as we parked. "Let's get a closer look at those bright colors you see in the postcards," he said, pulling me out of the car. We joined a small group of tourists at the boardwalk that winds around the hot springs. Everything was crowded at first, but the place felt surreal. Steam drifted above the water, and the colors of the spring itself rippled in strange patterns. I remember thinking how alien it felt to be so close to a pool that almost looked alive. Ray and I walked further from the main path, away from the noisy visitors. There was a side route where the park staff had placed orange cones to deter foot traffic. Ray studied the area and said, "Thomas, you game for a bit of exploring?" I wasn't in the mood to get fined, so I hesitated, but he grinned. "We'll be quick. No one's watching." He ducked under the rope, and I followed, more curious than obedient. The ground felt unsteady. A rickety wooden plank stretched across a pool of shimmering runoff. We moved carefully, not wanting to break through the fragile crust. The smell of minerals drifted around us. We stepped lightly, keeping our voices low out of an unspoken sense of respect for this strange land. Beyond that plank was a narrow stretch of ground leading toward some sparse trees. I figured we might see bison tracks or catch a different view of the steaming pools. But I saw neither. Instead, I spotted a faint path scuffed into the dirt, as though someone or something had dragged its limbs. I knelt to look at it more closely. It was long and meandering. My throat tightened. It seemed too large for any normal animal. Ray joined me. "That's weird," he whispered. I stared at him and felt my nerves jump. A low pulse of unease started thrumming through my body. It wasn't fear yet, just the distinct sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We pressed on, with Ray in front. The trees ahead were thin, and the earth around them had a pale crust. That was where I saw it, the same distorted outline that startled me at the boardwalk. At first, I thought it might be a trick of my vision, the haze, the reflection of the sun on the water, but then it moved again, more clearly, and the chill in my stomach turned sharper. I grabbed Ray's arm. He looked at me, confused, until he followed my gaze. Whatever we had glimpsed seemed tall and angular. Its limbs were elongated, and the head was set at a strange angle, as though it lacked a proper neck. I felt my body tense. Ray took a step forward, more curious than cautious. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. There was only a silent shift in the undergrowth, then nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe we'd seen a tourist wandering off the path. Yet the shape we'd seen looked far too thin, and its motions were erratic. Ray moved closer. I kept telling him in hushed tones that this was a bad idea, but he shrugged me off. Then we heard a snap of branches. I saw part of a torso scrape against a tree trunk, almost like the figure was testing the bark. It made my stomach twist. The torso was a patchwork of leathery gray skin stretched over ribs that jutted out in distinct lines. I whispered to Ray, "This doesn't look like any animal we know." He shot me a worried glance. We took a half step back, but the thing advanced. It came forward with quick, uneven strides, revealing a narrow head with slits for eyes. They were set too far apart, giving it a bizarre, almost vacant gaze. A sliver of drool hung at the edge of its mouth, slipping off in a slow drip. I didn't say a word. My chest went tight, and I could hear Ray's breath catch. He tried to step back again, but his foot sank into a patch of loose ground. I grabbed his arm to keep him from stumbling. When it realized we were staying put, it twisted its entire body toward us. My mind raced. I glanced around, hoping to see a ranger or a hiker with a radio, but we were alone. The line of trees was too sparse for cover, and behind us lay only the fragile ground and scalding hot springs. I felt trapped. Ray muttered, "Let's move." He tugged my sleeve, but I couldn't stop looking at this hideous presence in front of us. It quivered, as though it was winding itself up, preparing for something. We turned and ran. For the boardwalk. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, not daring to look over my shoulder. My lungs burned after just a few strides. The air near the hot springs felt dense, and fear pressed on my ribs. Ray sprinted ahead, yelling for help. Nobody answered. We had gone too far off the main path, and the tourist crowd was out of earshot. All I heard was the rapid thumping of my heart and the echo of Ray's fading cries. I forced myself to keep up, but the ground gave way under each frantic step. Out of nowhere, that ghastly presence intercepted us. I stumbled to a stop, barely keeping my balance. It crouched on a patch of higher ground, as though it had anticipated where we'd run. Ray skidded in place next to me. He cursed under his breath. The thing's frame twitched, and I realized just how wrong this entire scenario had become. We had no chance of outrunning it if it could move like that. Ray's voice trembled when he whispered, "What do we do?" I saw the shallow thermal pools around us, each ringed by thin crust. One misstep and we'd drop into near boiling water. The thing shifted forward with short, deliberate motions. It angled its head, and I spotted a gnarled mass of bone along its arms. Then it lunged. It didn't make a sound as it hurled itself forward. I dove sideways, scraping my shoulder on the brittle ground. Ray stumbled onto the boardwalk, but the boardwalk cracked beneath him, pitching him face first into a shallow run of scalding water. I heard him yelp in agony. It was on him in an instant, pinning him against the broken plank. I dared to look for a split second, and that was enough to see those limbs pressing Ray's torso into the water. The tension in its arms looked monstrous, as though it possessed a terrifying power. Ray flailed, shouting for help, and I tried to yank at the boardwalk to free him. My hands shook. My mind filled with a terrifying clarity. If I didn't break him loose, he'd be done for. I pulled with every ounce of strength. The plank splintered, releasing a chunk of wood that Ray had pinned beneath. Ray jerked free, coughing. His arms and chest were pink with burns. He could barely stand, but he rose on shaky legs, stumbling toward me. The thing's elongated head snapped toward us. I swore under my breath and pulled Ray along, bolting down the narrow walkway. Our goal was to reach the main trail or find any group of hikers. I didn't hear footsteps behind us, but I felt that presence, certain it was only a few paces away. We rounded a bend, passing a sign that warned tourists to stay on the path. Ray gasped, "Thomas, keep moving." We spotted a distant couple, maybe 100 yards away, but they looked like they were headed back to the parking lot. We yelled at them to wait. They glanced in our direction but seemed confused, and they quickly hurried off, perhaps thinking we were just being rowdy. Ray coughed violently, then leaned against me. I steadied him. My gaze flicked back, searching the tree line for any sign of that thing. For a moment, I saw nothing except the swirling haze above the springs. Then I glimpsed a tall shape weaving between the spindly trees. It paused when it saw we weren't alone. Ray muttered, "It's still following us." I placed a hand on his shoulder to calm him. My mind spun with the realization that we might have walked into a place that harbored something beyond comprehension, and there was no easy exit. We trudged onward. Every step for Ray was agony, and I had to keep him upright. We made it onto a wider section of walkway, where a few more tourists wandered. An older man in a wide-brimmed hat saw Ray's burns and rushed to help. I glanced over my shoulder one more time. That tall, angular being stood at the fringe of a small stand of trees, half hidden behind a trunk. It seemed to watch us with cold focus, as if measuring its next move. Then it slunk back, disappearing from sight. We huddled with the older man and a ranger who arrived a minute later, apparently alerted by someone who heard our shouts. The ranger asked, "What happened? Did someone get hurt by the hot springs?" Ray's teeth chattered, and he pointed shakily at the trees. I tried to explain, but I couldn't form the words that might make sense of what we saw. The ranger's brow furrowed, and he called for medical assistance over his radio. A small crowd formed, all of them focused on Ray's injuries. I stood there, panting, still feeling that dreadful sting of fear in my chest. I wanted to run back, to force proof of what we encountered, but I couldn't abandon Ray. Paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him out to a park ambulance. I stayed by his side, my heart still pounding. Nobody believed our hurried account of a bizarre, lean figure that tried to drown him. The ranger simply nodded, muttered about illusions caused by the steam and how the park's geothermal areas can play tricks on the eyes. I never got closure. The rest of the day was a blur of paperwork, hospital chatter, and half-whispered speculation. Ray's burns were severe but not life-threatening. By evening, we were both too exhausted to argue with the officials who dismissed our claims as panic or confusion. We'd gone off the approved path, and they insisted that was the only reason Ray got hurt. I gave up trying to convince anyone otherwise. Still, I know we saw something that shouldn't exist. We left Yellowstone as soon as Ray could walk without wincing. Neither of us had any appetite for further exploration. For months, I jolted awake at night, haunted by the memory of that gaunt shape leaning out from behind the trees. Ray and I didn't discuss it again, not in depth, because words seemed too small and uncertain. He had his scars, and I had the nightmares. That's all we brought home. I wish I could say I found a rational explanation, but I didn't. All I have is the memory of that silent, twisted outline and the knowledge that it walked away untouched. I think that's what unsettles me the most. It wasn't supposed to be there, yet there it was, in the same park where families come to snap photos and marvel at steaming pools. When I think of it now, I remember how my legs nearly gave out from sheer terror. I recall the burn on Ray's chest and the looks of disbelief on the faces around us. He calls me sometimes to talk about mundane things, a new job, weekend plans, or a random memory from our school days. We pretend everything is fine. But I sense we both carry that day inside us. And we go on. We have to. I will not return to that section of the boardwalk. I don't care how grand or vibrant that pool might be. We saw enough. That's the truth I carry, whether anyone believes me or not. It's mine to hold, and for me, that's final. The first sign that things had gone terribly wrong was the sudden snap of branches near the shore, followed by a sharp cry that vanished as fast as it appeared. My hands shook, and my throat felt tight. I spun around to see if anyone needed help, but an unnatural silence blanketed the entire area, making me realize we'd stumbled into a trap we never knew existed. My name is Jason Rockland, and this happened to me back in 2003 at Lewis Lake in Yellowstone. It was supposed to be a single day of exploration, just my buddy Travis and me doing some off-trail fishing. We arrived early that morning, carrying rods, sandwiches, and the kind of excitement that makes you careless. Travis joked about being a better fisherman than me, and I ribbed him right back about his slow casting. We had no reason to feel afraid. The lake looked calm and pristine. Pines stood all around, and the gentle whisper of the water on the shore made me think we'd found a slice of paradise. A ranger had mentioned a few black bears roaming the distant hills, but that didn't bother us. We'd come prepared with bear spray, wearing bright clothing to avoid any misunderstandings. Neither of us had an inkling about what truly lurked behind the dark trunks. We picked a secluded spot about a quarter-mile from the usual fishing stretch, hoping to find less touched waters. Travis was an endless chatterbox that day. He laughed, told a silly joke about losing his lure in an old lady's umbrella last summer, and made me promise I wouldn't mention that to anyone back home. I teased him a little, then cast my line. It felt good to stand there, with the silent morning and the shiver of the line as it cut into the water. Soon enough, I heard a faint rustle in the distance. I told Travis to hush, thinking it might be a moose approaching. Instead, we spotted a fallen tree that looked half-chewed. The trunk was shredded, as if something had torn it apart. Travis studied it and muttered that no normal animal would do it that way. The bark had been ripped open and left in splinters. He asked if I thought it was a bear. I said maybe, even though the damage looked odd, as if done with precise, savage strength rather than random claws. We shrugged it off after a few minutes. We believed we were overthinking it. We dropped our lines again and cast near the deeper part of the lake. We stood there for maybe 15 minutes, exchanging small talk. Then I heard a branch snap behind us. Not a mild crack but a harsh, abrupt break that echoed across the shoreline. I glanced at Travis, and he mouthed, "What was that?" I didn't have an answer. My heart hammered so loud I could almost hear it in my ears. I mouthed back, "Let's check," because ignoring it felt worse. We moved closer to the tree line, rods tucked under our arms, eyes wide. That's when we noticed drag marks on the ground, as if something had been pulled across the damp soil. There were splashes of dark red on leaves and grass, forcing us to confront the fact that we weren't alone. Travis lost his grin. I tried to say something reassuring but only managed a shaky, "We need to be careful." We pressed ahead, each step more tentative than the last. A strangled gasp cut through the silence. It sounded human. I yelled, "Anyone there?" No reply came. The hush that followed felt more threatening than any scream. We shared a glance that said everything: this was wrong. A few more steps, and we saw a tangle of torn clothing near a half-crushed bush. It looked like some kind of park uniform, ripped apart. A radio lay beside it, shorting out with static. My stomach turned. Travis reached down to pick it up, but a sudden noise from deeper in the woods stopped him. We crept forward, each footfall muffled by thick pine needles. That's when we saw the silhouette. It stood about 8 feet tall, arms hanging low, spine curved in a dreadful posture. Even at a distance, I noticed the rough scales across its shoulders, darker than the bark around it, and the way its muzzle looked stretched, as if sculpted by some cruel joke of nature. Travis and I ducked behind a log, trying to calm our breathing. I wanted to rationalize it, a wild animal, maybe an odd bison or moose we'd never encountered, but the shape was all wrong. Its head jerked side to side, sniffing the air with an uncanny intelligence. I touched Travis's arm and whispered, "Don't move." We waited. My knee started to ache, but I refused to shift even an inch. Then it did something that made my stomach twist. It leaned over and lifted a mangled shape from the ground. I glimpsed a human face, eyes wide open. Everything in me wanted to scream, but I bit down on my lip and tasted copper. It was too late for that person. We remained frozen while this hulking figure dragged its victim away, leaving a trail of disturbed dirt. Travis was trembling next to me. He whispered, "We can't just stand here," and I knew he was right. We counted to 3, then scrambled back to the lakeshore. Our fishing rods clattered on the rocks. We didn't care. Survival trumped everything else. As we ran, Travis kept glancing behind us, fearful that it might be following. The biggest question gnawed at me: could we escape if it decided to give chase? My lungs started to burn. I'd never realized how large the park could feel, how every tree seemed to block our path. At one point, I tripped over a root and tumbled down a small slope, landing on my shoulder. Travis helped me up. My arm was throbbing, but adrenaline kept me moving. We reached a rocky patch near the water. Travis whispered, "We need help." "Where's the nearest ranger station?" I had no clue. We traveled off the beaten path. Our phones had no signal, and our best bet seemed to be following the lake's perimeter back to the main trail. Maybe we'd find other people, or a boat, or anything that could get us out. The sun reached its peak, and everything felt unnaturally still. Our relief was short-lived when we saw more signs of devastation. Another downed tree lay across the path, splintered at the midpoint. Large footprints dotted the mud. Each print suggested a wide, elongated foot with sharp edges. Travis didn't bother analyzing them. He just kept muttering that we had to hurry. My heart pounded. Every shadow between the pines felt like an ambush waiting to happen. Suddenly, a crash in the undergrowth made us spin around. There it was, standing on a rise, black eyes fixed on us. Its limbs were too long, the torso too gaunt. The face was unmistakably feral, with a short row of barbed spines running along the jaw. I grabbed a broken branch from the ground, like that could do anything. Travis and I locked eyes, silently agreeing that we had no choice but to run or fight. He reached for the bear spray, but it was still looped on his backpack, which he dropped when we first panicked. We had nothing except the branch in my hands. In a burst of motion, the thing rushed toward us, each stride faster than any human sprint. I shouted at Travis to split up, hoping to confuse it. He darted right, I charged left, heading for a rocky outcropping along the shore. My mind was a blur. I heard Travis yelling, cursing, then a sudden crash of brush and an awful, wet thumping sound that seemed to echo off the pines. For a moment, I turned to look and caught a glimpse of him pinned against a fallen trunk. The thing hunched over him, and my vision blurred as I realized what was happening. My instincts screamed at me to keep going. Survival is cruel like that. I stumbled forward, trying not to collapse. I heard nothing behind me, which was somehow worse. Reaching the water, I found a small empty rowboat tied to a half-rotten dock plank. It looked abandoned, but I yanked at the rope to free it. My hands fumbled, and tears burned my eyes as I pictured Travis. I can't say how I got that knot undone. Maybe desperation gave me speed. Within seconds, I clambered into the boat and started rowing. I expected at any moment to feel a massive blow, to see that silhouette looming over me. Yet no attack came. The only sound was the oar slicing through the lake. Halfway across, I looked back. The shoreline was empty, though I thought I saw the outlines of pines swaying, as if something large moved among them. I pictured Travis's face and felt nausea rolling in my stomach. My arms trembled so badly I could barely keep rowing, but I forced myself onward. Reaching the far bank took me a while, and I nearly collapsed when the boat scraped against gravel. My mouth was dry. I almost dropped to my knees then and there, but the fear kept me upright. There had to be a trailhead or a road. Dazed, I began stumbling through the timber, my only thought to find another person, a ranger, anyone who could help. Minutes turned into an hour. Finally, I found an old service road. A truck rattled by, and I flagged it down, stammering that a friend was hurt, that we needed immediate help. Park authorities later swarmed the area. I told them where to search. They returned with grim faces, but they never spoke much about what they discovered. I overheard one ranger mutter about things in the wild that don't match any manual. They asked me questions for hours, but I doubt they believed half of what I said. They never made an official statement about Travis. They simply filed him under missing, and I was too shaken to protest. I left Yellowstone that same evening, riding in the back of an official truck, wearing a vacant stare that didn't fade for weeks. I didn't tell anyone else the details, but I still dream about that day. Sometimes, I can't help but see Travis's final glance, a mixture of terror and regret in his eyes. I remind myself that I tried to save him, but that truth does little to ease my thoughts. I never returned to Lewis Lake. I never had the courage to. That place belongs to whatever prowls those woods. And I am done trying to question it. I spotted a strange figure near a cluster of lodgepole pines, and my chest tightened the instant I registered its improbable shape. No person should move with that unnatural fluidity. I could feel my breath catch as it turned its gaze on me, if that silhouette even had eyes. I knew I'd stumbled onto something I had no business seeing. My instinct whispered for me to turn around, but I stayed. That single choice threatened everything I believed was safe. My name is Travis Corbin, and this happened to me back in 2009 in the Beckler region of Yellowstone National Park. I'd arrived early that morning, driving in with a backpack stuffed full of snacks, a flashlight, and an old map. I was anxious to explore an area my Uncle Ned used to rave about. He'd spoken of hidden waterfalls and hot springs that only seasoned backcountry hikers ever saw. Sounded like an adventure. I'd taken a short hike, reached a shallow canyon, and felt that sense of giddy wonder you get when the world seems brand new. Standing at the base of a small waterfall, I felt certain the day would be one of quiet exploration. I had the bright idea to wander off the marked trail in hopes of finding a better angle for photos. I knew better, but sometimes curiosity wins. The forest was thick with pine and spruce. Broken branches snapped under my boots, and every so often I'd spot a hare darting away. After about an hour, I found what looked like strange tracks pressed into the muddy bank of a creek. They were elongated, almost human in outline but longer, with a gap between the toes that didn't belong to anything I recognized. I crouched and touched the fresh prints. They looked too large for any person I'd ever met, though definitely bipedal. It gave me a jolt, but I brushed it off. Not long after, I heard someone call out. A young ranger named Mason came crashing through the undergrowth, short of breath and wild-eyed. He had his uniform on and carried a radio that kept spitting static. He asked, "Hey, have you seen anyone else around here?" I shook my head. He pressed his lips together. "Some families at the main campground claimed they heard weird noises last night. I got sent to investigate because I'm the rookie." He tried to laugh it off, but I could see worry etched on his face. I told him I'd seen odd footprints, not sure if that was relevant. He asked me to show him. We walked side by side through the tangle of brush until we returned to the creek. The footprints were still there, more distinct than I'd realized. Mason crouched down, ran his gloved hand along the edge, and said, "This is messed up." "But there's no rule against messed up, is there?" He was forcing a grin. Then he grabbed his radio and tried to call his supervisor, but all he got was a burst of static. He tapped the radio. Great, the battery's shot or the reception's garbage. We both stared at the tracks in silence. Our plan was to head back toward the station, but we kept spotting more of those prints. They crossed in random directions, weaving through the brush. Then we reached a wide clearing. A fallen deer lay in the grass. Its leg was bent at a strange angle, and the ground around it showed signs of a struggle. Something had dragged it, that much was obvious. Mason whispered, "What in the world?" "There should be, signs of a usual scavenger." He didn't finish the thought, but I knew what he meant. There were smears and dark splashes, though I forced myself not to look too closely. I felt a wave of nausea. A silent jolt of fear spiked my pulse. We decided to skirt the clearing and hurry back. Mason took the lead, and I stayed close. The sun was higher now, filtering through the canopy and leaving bright spots on the forest floor. Branches creaked above us. Every sound seemed magnified. Each twig snap made me glance over my shoulder. Then we heard a rustle, not far off, like something heavy pushing through foliage. We both stopped. Mason raised a hand for quiet. I inched forward, trying to see. That's when we saw it. Standing behind a dead log was a shape the size of a tall man, clothed in coarse hair that clung to limbs too long for normal human proportions. Its arms hung low, and each hand ended in jagged nails. The face was obscured by matted hair, but I sensed it was watching us. Before I could blink, it slipped behind a patch of ferns. Mason grabbed my arm and hissed, "Run." We sprinted. My legs burned, and my lungs felt tight. Branches lashed my face as we rushed through the dense pines. I wasn't used to running on rough terrain, and my boots slid on fallen needles. Mason yanked me upright when I stumbled. We couldn't see the thing anymore, but we sensed it. I heard a snap behind us, like a heavy branch giving way, followed by the sound of something moving fast. We broke into another clearing, large and ringed by thick pines. Mason pulled me behind a boulder. We tried to catch our breath in hushed gasps. He peered around the edge and swore under his breath. I couldn't help myself. I leaned forward. The shape was at the tree line, scanning the area, though it had no clear eyes to speak of. I noticed random patches of missing fur across its torso and legs, as if it had survived many battles. My entire body shook. Mason tried his radio again. Nothing but static. I whispered, "What do we do?" He swallowed hard. "We make a break for the ranger station. It's maybe a mile and a half. Stick close." We crept from behind the boulder, but the thing took notice. It cut us off with impossible speed, crossing the clearing in a few bounding strides. Mason and I backed away, hearts hammering. A low hiss escaped from behind its hair. Without warning, it slashed at Mason's leg, leaving him on the ground, gripping a ragged tear in his pants. I saw him grimace, his face twisted in pain. I yelled, "Hey," and tried to distract it, waving my arms, as if that might help. My stomach clenched in fear. The thing turned its head my way, lips peeling back, revealing crooked teeth. I stepped back on shaky legs. It advanced, each movement unnervingly silent. Mason grabbed a rock and threw it. The rock struck its shoulder, and it glared at him. That brief moment was all I needed to haul Mason up and shove him forward. "Go!" I shouted. We stumbled through the undergrowth, branches scratching our arms. The station was close, Mason said, though everything looked identical in the forest. Then, to our left, a small path came into view. I recognized the route from my earlier hike. Relief washed over me, but we still heard the sounds of rustling behind us. We pressed on, hearts pounding, Mason limping badly. "I can't keep up," he rasped. "You gotta go." "No way," I said, forcing him to lean on my shoulder. We pushed forward together. For several minutes, the forest remained silent. We finally saw the ranger station's metal roof rising beyond a stand of aspens. With a burst of adrenaline, we hurried over a short ridge and clattered onto the gravel path. The building was there, locked up tight, but behind it sat a small supply shed. I ducked inside with Mason, slammed the door, and threw the bolt. We collapsed in a corner, gasping. Mason was trying not to shout from the pain in his leg. I tore off a piece of his uniform shirt and bound the wound. "We'll wait here," I said, "and hope backup arrives soon." He nodded, though his eyes glistened with fear. Through a gap in the shed wall, I could see the tree line. Nothing moved. My arms were trembling, and I realized I was half laughing from sheer nerves. Mason's radio squawked, then fizzled again. I gave him a wavering smile. "At least we know it still works." He mustered a small grin, then stared at the bandage. "Thanks," he said. I patted his shoulder, though my hands felt clammy. I had no clue if that thing was out there, pacing around the station, or if it had darted back into the deeper forest. My mind flicked to those footprints and that fallen deer. The puzzle pieces fit. It roamed the backcountry, hunting at twilight and dawn. No one ever seemed to get a good look, yet there were rumors. Old legends, maybe. Half an hour passed. Then a truck engine rumbled up the road, and we heard voices calling our names. Mason shouted back, and soon two older rangers burst into the shed. One took one look at Mason's leg and said, "We'll get you to the hospital. Keep that covered." They asked me 100 questions at once, but I could hardly form words. When I tried to explain, I sounded half crazy. The rangers walked us to the truck, scanning the forest with wide eyes. We sped off toward the main road. By nightfall, Mason was being treated, and I was giving a statement to a grizzled senior ranger. He listened with a sober expression. I expected him to mock me, but he only said, "You'd be amazed at what people claim to see out there." I couldn't tell if he believed me or not. I spent a sleepless evening in a cheap motel in West Yellowstone, staring at the ceiling, listening to every rattle of the air conditioner. My mind lingered on the memory of that twisted silhouette. I left first thing in the morning, desperate to be anywhere else. On the long drive out, I tried to convince myself I'd overreacted, that maybe it was just a bear with some disease and an odd gait. But I'd stood barely 10 feet away. I knew that was no explanation. Mason left me a voicemail a few days later, sounding better, but shaken. He didn't want to talk details either. We were both stuck with memories no one else would believe. I sometimes think about those footprints in the creek bed and that odd hiss in the clearing. Every so often I feel that spike of adrenaline, a flash of that impossible face. I can still picture its ragged fur, the black nails, and the raw fury in its stance. I'll never be certain what it was or why it stalked us that day. But I'm certain it's not forgotten. And I doubt it ever will. People told me I'd find a moment of peace by the rocky shore, yet I ended up running so fast I tore my bootlaces. An abandoned campsite stood eerily silent under the light, cooking gear scattered like it had been tossed in a rush. I stepped closer and spotted torn fabric and deep marks in the dirt that made my stomach twist. Whatever made those marks didn't want to be found, at least not yet. That was my first warning. My name is Caleb Morrison, and this happened back in 2007 at Yellowstone Lake. I was supposed to spend just one day there, driving in early and leaving before dark. That morning, I arrived with a trunk full of snacks, spare clothes, and a map I borrowed from my friend Luis, a ranger who worked seasonal shifts around the park. We'd planned to meet near a trailhead to do a short hike and then fish by the water. I parked at the small lot, locked my car, and walked about half a mile down a narrow path framed by tall pines. It smelled of pine needles and wet earth. I remember a calm feeling in my chest, thinking I'd spend a peaceful day catching trout. Then I found the campsite. I spotted a cluster of tents behind a few boulders near a lonely pine. At first, I thought the place was empty, maybe left behind by tourists in a hurry. The half-buried cooler, the folding chairs, the random groceries, none of it looked tampered with. But the chairs were overturned, and the tents were slashed open in a way that made no sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a ranger had done a quick teardown because the campers left a mess. But I saw no official tags or notes, just chaos. I crouched to examine some footprints in the soft dirt. They looked like elongated impressions with wide spacing, almost as if someone with huge boots had paced around. My mind flipped through possibilities: a local who wanted to spook travelers, maybe a hungry beast rummaging for food. I took a step toward the nearest tent. That's when I realized there was a smear of dried red on a torn sleeping bag. I tried to swallow, but my mouth felt like sandpaper. Luis emerged from the trail, radio in hand. He was a tall guy with a playful grin most days, but that grin vanished once he saw the mess. He called out, "Caleb, back away. Don't touch anything." He looked around, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said quietly, "I'm not sure what happened here, but you should head up the path while I contact the station." I agreed, but my eyes kept drifting to the footprints. We both stood there, scanning the scene. I saw cooking utensils flung across the ground, as if dinner had been interrupted. Luis fumbled with his radio, trying to get a signal. He mumbled something about the frequency cutting out. Meanwhile, I walked around the perimeter, drawn by those strange tracks. I wanted to find a pattern, some sense that this was a prank or a freak accident. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Whoever or whatever made those prints had walked to the tents, circled them, and dragged something heavy back toward the trees. Luis finally got a weak connection, and I heard him mention something about an abandoned site near the lake, possible sign of violence. Then static cut him off. He glanced at me, said, "I need to move closer to the station tower. Stay put, or if you feel unsafe, go back to your car." With that, he jogged uphill, leaving me alone with a swirl of questions. I told myself I'd take a quick look around, see if there was anyone injured or in need of help. I followed the tracks into the trees. About 20 yards in, I found a patch of flattened brush. Broken branches formed a rough circle. My nose picked up a foul odor, like rancid meat. I stared at the dried stains that speckled the ground. Nearby, I saw more footprints. They were larger than I'd thought, each one at least twice as long as my own foot, with splayed-out impressions at the front. The place felt wrong, like I'd stepped into a zone where no normal person had any right to be. A twig snapped behind me. I froze. I turned slowly, half expecting to see Luis, but I saw a shape that stood taller than me by at least 2 heads. It had sparse, dirty fur clinging to a broad torso and arms that bent at angles too sharp to be human. Its face was hidden behind matted hair and what seemed like patches of thick hide. My body locked up. I couldn't form a single word. Then the thing took one heavy stride forward, letting me see the dull glint of its eyes. I backed away, careful not to trip. My hands shook, and my heart hammered so hard my ears buzzed. The shape regarded me in silence. It exhaled with a wet rasp that made my stomach flip. It shifted its weight, turning its head as if sizing me up. My mind screamed for me to run, but I couldn't abandon Luis. Still, I knew I wasn't going to do Luis any favors if I got torn apart right there. I bolted. Branches whipped my face, and the undergrowth snagged my pants, but I kept going. As I reached the clearing with the tents, I risked a glance behind me. The shape moved between the trunks, slow and methodical, like it had no reason to hurry. That almost frightened me more than a sprinting charge. I yelled Luis's name, but the only response was my own ragged breathing. I raced up the path toward my car. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they might catch fire. When I crested the rise, I spotted Luis near his truck, messing with the radio, frustration on his face. I waved frantically. He saw me and ran over. I gasped out a few jumbled words, pointing back down the slope. He grabbed a shotgun from the truck bed, racked it, and told me to show him exactly where I saw it. I didn't have the nerve to protest. Together, we went back to the camp. My steps felt heavier with each yard we covered, like wading into a nightmare. Luis's radio squawked. A voice came through, but all we caught was a partial message about units en route and stay put. At least that meant backup was coming. Luis gestured for me to stay low and keep quiet as we edged around the last boulder. The camp looked even worse in the midday sun. The slashed tents flapped in a slight breeze, the overturned gear scattering shadows across the ground. Luis moved closer, scanning the edge of the trees with his shotgun raised. I stayed a few steps behind, squinting at the spots where I first saw those footprints. They were deeper now, more pronounced, like the ground had settled. My nose twitched with that same rotten smell. A low rustling came from the brush, and then we saw it. This time, it stood out in broad daylight, no illusions. Tall, broad-chested, covered in patchy fur that hung off its limbs in clumps. Its arms looked too long for its body, ending in thick, blunt fingers. Part of me wanted to laugh at the impossibility, but the stench in the air choked any humor I might find. Luis aimed, hand steady. He locked eyes with the thing. It took a single step and snapped a branch underfoot like it was nothing. I hid behind a torn tent, peering out while Luis shouted, "Stop! Back off!" It didn't respond, just tilted its head. Luis fired a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed across the campsite, sending a flock of birds skyward. The shape flinched at the noise but didn't back down. Instead, it tensed, muscles coiling, as if ready to spring. I heard another shot. This time, the thing recoiled, letting out a harsh, strangled grunt that made my blood run cold. I thought it would charge, but it stayed put, glaring at us. A dark stain spread across its side. Luis pumped the shotgun and fired again, hitting it square. It staggered, let out another ragged exhale, then turned and bolted into the trees with surprising speed. We stood there, hearts pounding, not sure if we should follow or hold position. Luis, voice shaking, said, "Stay with me. Don't go after it." I had no desire to chase that monstrosity. We stayed in place, scanning the tree line, half expecting it to come crashing back. When it didn't, Luis finally lowered his weapon. We decided we needed to see if anyone was still alive. We searched around the campsite, calling out for survivors. We found no trace of the campers except their belongings, which still felt warm from the morning sun. A single wallet lay near a pile of clothes, filled with a few crumpled bills and a driver's license for a man named Greg Turner from Denver. We found no footprints that suggested anyone else had walked away. A horror settled over me as I realized Greg and whoever was with him must have met that thing. We kept scanning the woods in case it returned. The park radio squawked again. We caught bits of conversation, more rangers heading in our direction. Luis grabbed my arm and said we should retreat toward the station. I followed him up the path, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My nerves were shot. Even the crunch of my boots made me jump. We climbed a ridge, then cut across a small clearing that led to a service road. Luis's truck was parked there. He helped me in, turned the key, and we sped off, leaving the campsite behind. Rangers arrived within the hour, but by the time they reached the spot, the shape was gone. They reported more footprints, deeper in the forest, and signs that something large had moved through the undergrowth. I gave my account to a stern-faced officer who took notes and asked if I was sure I hadn't run into a stray bison or a wounded elk. I just shook my head, unable to explain what we'd seen in any rational terms. Luis stayed quiet, nodding in agreement with me, but he was pale as a sheet. They escorted us back to the ranger station, kept us for a few hours of questioning, and then advised us not to discuss it further. We were told an official investigation would follow. I never heard the final report, if there was one. I left Yellowstone Lake that evening, tossing the map Luis gave me into the back seat. My head throbbed with questions, and every time I shut my eyes, I saw that face, angular, half hidden by ragged fur, and those eyes that looked far too knowing. I drove out of the park before sunset, feeling both lucky and terrified, like I had escaped a nightmare that didn't belong in our world. I tried to tell myself it made no sense, that I must have misread the entire situation. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it was real. That afternoon has lived with me ever since, playing through my mind like a loop I can't pause. I have no neat conclusion. I just have the memory of those footprints and that abandoned campsite. That single day taught me a lesson, though, the wild has its own secrets. And I saw one of them up close. I don't know if I'll ever be able to set foot there again. But I'm still breathing, and that alone feels like a borrowed mercy. I bolted between steam-vending fissures, heart pounding like a hammer on an anvil, convinced that shape was closing in on me. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded too loud, every hot breath in my throat tasted like panic. There was no time to think. I stumbled over a rock, nearly collapsing in a muddy patch, sure that one misstep would end me. My world had become a single frantic mission, keep moving or vanish forever under that looming shadow. My name is Jack Connolly, and this happened in 2008 at Norris Geyser Basin in Yellowstone National Park. I'd driven up from Idaho that morning, eager for a quiet day of exploration. No major crowds, just a good friend and me checking out some lesser-known pockets of the park. Marshall was the one who nudged me away from the main boardwalks, insisting we hike a narrow side trail he'd heard about from a local ranger. We parked the truck, topped off our water bottles, and started walking. He said he wanted to find something unique, maybe an isolated geyser that few people ever visit. We passed wisps of steam drifting from milky blue pools. The stench of sulfur got stronger as we ventured deeper. Marshall joked that this corner of Yellowstone felt like an alien landscape. I laughed, but I was nervous. My stomach was off, like I had swallowed something too big for my gut. We wandered further until we lost sight of the main path altogether. The boardwalk rails were nowhere behind us. The ground was wet, thick with clay, dotted by stunted trees twisted by geothermal heat. At the time, I thought the strangest thing about our surroundings was the quiet, a stillness that pressed on us. Around midday, we hit a spot where the ground seemed baked and cracked, with just a few yellow grass patches. That was when we saw the footprints, if you could call them that. They weren't shaped like any paw print or boot mark I'd known, more like wide splayed toes with bits of black scum marking each depression. Marshall bent down and pressed his palm against one of them. It dwarfed his hand. The spacing between these impressions suggested a stride far longer than a man's. We exchanged uneasy looks. Could be a big cat, Marshall guessed. But I saw the doubt in his eyes. He'd served in the military, had tracked all sorts of animals on training ops, but this didn't match anything he recognized. I felt my pulse speeding up. The sensation was confusing. Part of me wanted to laugh at the idea that we were spooking ourselves over weird prints. The other part told me to leave, fast. Still, we decided to push on. We found a flimsy game trail that led through a cluster of crooked pines. Low-hanging branches whipped against our jackets. The wind carried a faint hiss from the geysers behind us. As we walked, Marshall and I tried to keep it light with small talk about the day's plan. But his voice stayed hushed, and I couldn't match his forced optimism. Eventually, we came across a scattering of half-chewed bones near a hollow log. Some scattered hair clung to them. The arrangement looked unnatural, like they had been piled or shoved together. I glanced at Marshall, hoping he'd conjure a logical explanation. He just swallowed, nodding for us to keep going. We had no reason to linger. Then we heard a soft scraping, almost like nails dragged across bark. We froze. My ears strained. I saw movement through the trees, a flash of dark shape weaving between trunks. Marshall pointed toward a tall ridge ahead. Without speaking, we made for higher ground. The climb wasn't steep, but every step sank in damp dirt. The crackling steam from vents below us started to fade. We reached a flat area where a dried pool had left mineral crust on the rocks. More twisted footprints lined the perimeter. That's where we realized we weren't the only ones scanning the ridge. Down the slope, I caught a glimpse of something crossing the clearing at an unnatural angle. It stood on two bony limbs, yet hunched low, as if its spine was crooked. Its arms hung longer than a human's, knuckles grazing near the ground. Its hide looked mottled, an oily mix of brown and gray. Where the shoulders met the neck, I could see small protrusions like jagged horns. Marshall grabbed my jacket sleeve, eyes fixed on that shape. It paused, sniffed at the air, then dragged itself toward the skeleton pile we had passed. I wasn't sure if it sensed us or if we'd gone unnoticed. We crouched behind a fallen trunk. My mouth was dry. Marshall mouthed, "What in the world is that?" But I couldn't reply. My hands trembled. I remember thinking that if we stayed perfectly still, maybe it would shuffle on. It didn't. Instead, it lifted its head, scanning the area with large black eyes set in a wide, misshapen skull. The sudden tension in my gut told me that it had caught our scent. Then it let out a short, raspy exhalation and moved fast, plowing through shrubs, striding with terrifying strength. I signaled to Marshall to back up slowly. We stepped over rocks, careful not to dislodge any. For a second, I believed we could slip away. A branch snapped under Marshall's boot. That crack tore the silence open. The shape pivoted and locked its gaze on us. I saw its torso expand in a sickening shudder. Its lips parted, revealing angled teeth. We took off, practically tumbling down the backside of the ridge, sliding in the mud. My mind blanked. All I knew was that I had to outrun the thing behind me. Branches whipped my face. Steam from fissures burned in my nostrils. I heard a heavy thrashing that got closer, then retreated, then drew close again. Marshall was ahead, clutching at the trunk of a stunted pine to keep his balance. The thing bounded to my left, rocking the ground with each impact. I crashed through a stand of young firs, ignoring the sting of scraped skin, until Marshall yanked me behind a boulder. We pressed ourselves against the stone, panting hard. Above us, the shape prowled, scraping across the boulder's top. I could see its gnarled claws hooking over the rock's edge. Marshall looked at me, terror in his eyes. We heard it sniff the air again. My body went rigid. I thought if I so much as sneezed, it would drag us out. Then a distant geyser erupted with a booming hiss, drawing the thing's attention. It scuttled off, giving us an opening. We sprinted, weaving through a maze of thermal pockets. The ground hissed and bubbled under thin crusts. I almost crashed through a spot that looked stable but sank beneath my foot. Marshall pulled me free, leaving my boot soaked and scalded. The smell of sulfur clung to us. I glimpsed the shape on a distant slope, scanning the terrain. We slid behind a cluster of rocks. My heart pounded so hard I thought my chest would burst. Marshall wanted to make a break for the ranger station, but we weren't sure how to get back. Our path had twisted so many times. We decided to push east, guided by the sun overhead, hoping we'd intersect the main boardwalk. We moved quickly, with every snap of a twig sending fresh waves of anxiety through me. The trees got denser for a while, and the ground felt more solid. For a moment, I believed we might reach help. Then Marshall froze, raising his arm. He pointed to a fallen log beside a hot spring. A man's backpack lay shredded, straps ripped, contents scattered. We spotted a phone case, a battered flashlight, a half-eaten protein bar. No sign of the owner. Fear took over. We didn't dare call out for the person. We knew who might have found them first. We picked up the pace, practically jogging until we spotted the wide boardwalk in the distance. My soul soared at the sight of the sturdy railing and tourists snapping photos of funerals. That was our lifeline. I heard a rush behind us. We turned. That towering figure was bounding in our direction, weaving among the steaming vents, each stride impossibly swift. Marshall screamed, "Run!" I dashed with everything in me. My lungs burned. The boardwalk was still too far. My mind screamed that we wouldn't make it. At the last second, Marshall grabbed a fallen branch and hurled it like a spear. It struck the shape's side, halting it for just an instant. That gave me enough time to scramble over a muddy slope. Then, in a blur, the shape lunged for Marshall, snatching at his shirt. Marshall wrenched free, but he lost his footing and tumbled into a shallow geothermal pool. He let out a cry as the scalding water soaked his left side. I reached him, hauling him up. We stumbled onward, hearts pounding. We clambered over a small rock formation and found ourselves at the edge of the tourist walkway. Several onlookers gawked at us. I tried to speak, but my words came out in gasps. Park officials appeared, ushering the crowd back. One ranger rushed toward us, her face tight with concern. Marshall collapsed to his knees, moaning from the burn. I glanced behind me, expecting to see that unnatural shape vault over the rocks, but there was only the swirl of steam and the faint hiss of vents. We were safe for the moment, though that was little comfort. I wanted to warn everyone to get away. My voice failed me. An hour later, we were in a small clinic area by the park entrance. A medic was treating Marshall's burns. Two rangers grilled me about what we'd seen. I tried to describe it, but my words sounded ridiculous, even to me. They exchanged glances that suggested they didn't believe a word. They probably wrote us off as a couple of hikers who'd gotten spooked by a bison or a stray wolf. They asked if we had been drinking. I shook my head, feeling helpless. Before sunset, a ranger told us we should rest. Marshall managed to stand with help, insisting we leave as soon as possible. Nobody saw what we saw, and I doubt they took our warnings seriously. The faint sting of sulfur still clung to my clothes. My arms felt shaky. I remember looking back at the distant mist rolling over the basin, certain that thing was out there, hidden among the pines and steaming vents. We drove out quietly, each of us replaying that moment behind the boulder. We didn't speak much on the ride. Marshall just stared at the road, eyes wide and haunted. In the final stretch, he asked me, "Do you think anybody will find it?" I didn't answer. I just watched the trees blur past the window. When I got home, my legs still trembled from the adrenaline. I tried to settle in, but sleep refused me. The memory of that shape gliding across scorched ground kept surfacing. I told myself we survived, and that was all that mattered. But sometimes I catch myself thinking about those footprints and the bones in the clearing. I don't know if anyone else will see what we saw, but I'd never wander off trail in that basin again. I finished my tea, set the cup down, and shut my eyes. I tried to forget the twisted outline moving between crooked pines. I couldn't. Trees snapped in half across a path. A thick stench hung in the air, harsh and metallic. I stumbled forward, trying to figure out who or what could leave such devastation behind. My hands shook as I spotted deep slashes on the trunk of a fallen pine. An uneasy knot formed in my stomach, reminding me that I was alone, and whatever caused this destruction might still be nearby. This was about to escalate in ways I never thought possible. My name is Henry Caldwell, and this happened in 2009 near the Madison campground in Yellowstone National Park. I had driven there early that morning, determined to enjoy a day of fishing and maybe spot some wildlife along the riverbank. The campground, usually buzzing with families and curious tourists, felt oddly quiet. I told myself it was just off-season emptiness, but something about the silence made my shoulders tense. I planned to set up a small tent by midday, fish until sunset, then drive back out of the park before nightfall. Seemed simple enough. A ranger named Grant waved at me when I parked. He was lean, with a weathered face and a quick grin. He asked if I was alone. When I said yes, he suggested I keep to the main trails. I cracked a joke, telling him I had no plans of wandering off and having to learn how to gnaw on pine cones for survival. He chuckled, but I noticed his eyes flick toward the dense trees, just for a second. I should have asked him why he looked so uneasy. I walked along the Madison River, rod in hand, scanning for trout. The water shone bright, and every so often I felt a flicker of warmth from the sun on my neck. I enjoyed the quiet for the first hour, watching birds dart overhead. Around mid-morning, I pulled in my line and switched spots, heading upstream. That was when I noticed a fallen pine, bark peeled away as if someone had taken a gigantic file to it. The trunk was scarred, and the ground had fresh tears in the dirt, big enough to fit my fist. It looked too strange to be from any normal animal. I tried to shrug it off, but the memory of Grant's fleeting, worried glance nagged at me. A few minutes later, I found a small wooden footbridge. Halfway across, I heard a faint rustling behind me, like feet dragging through loose needles. I whirled around and called out. No answer. I forced a laugh, telling myself I was spooked by a squirrel or an elk that got startled. Yet, I couldn't shake the sense that something more sentient had been observing me. By noon, I made it back to my campsite and found it in disarray. My cooler had been flipped, contents scattered across the ground. The lid was torn open, metal hinges bent at odd angles. My fishing vest lay shredded by a large rock, with deep gouges through the fabric. I checked around for footprints but only saw strange hollows in the mud that didn't look like any boot or paw I recognized. When I spotted a glimmer of red smear on the inside of the cooler, a sick feeling spread through my gut. It looked like blood, though I couldn't guess which unlucky creature it belonged to. I decided to report it, so I packed my essentials and made my way toward the ranger's cabin. My humor started failing me around that point because my mind buzzed with gruesome possibilities. Why would a vandal or a large animal rummage so violently? And what made those odd marks on the ground? Ranger Grant wasn't in. A note pinned to the door said he'd gone searching for a missing hiker reported at dawn. The penmanship was hurried, the ink smudged. I figured I'd track him along the main trails. But I'd hardly left the cabin when I heard someone shout in the distance. It echoed, cracked, then stopped. I told myself it might just be an argument or a cry for help, so I sprinted toward the sound, skidding on loose pebbles. I followed the voice to a grove of tall pines. My heart hammered when I found a backpack, torn apart, contents strewn around. A phone with a shattered screen blinked a low battery warning. A half-eaten energy bar lay ground into the dirt. Nearby, a wide patch of grass was flattened, as if something had rolled or thrashed around. I didn't see the hiker, but I could smell a metallic tang in the air that reminded me of the cooler. Dread crawled up my throat. Suddenly, Ranger Grant emerged from behind a cluster of thorny shrubs. His eyes were bulging, and his breath came in fast bursts. He said, "It got him. I don't know what that thing is." I wanted to ask what he'd seen, but he just shook his head as if words couldn't do it justice. We heard a crash from deeper in the grove, followed by a gurgling hiss that made me flinch. Grant raised his rifle, and I grabbed a fallen branch for support, not sure whether to run or stand my ground. We edged forward. My pulse pounded as I smelled wet fur and something sharper, like rotting algae. Leaves rustled. We caught a glimpse of a large silhouette with a wide back bristling with ridged spines. Its posture was hunched, arms held forward with unsettling length. Its fingers stretched too far, each tipped with black nails. Grant raised his rifle again, but a violent thrashing of branches blocked our view. Something heavy slammed into a tree. A low, throaty hiss followed, and then the entire grove fell still. I could hear Grant's breath hitching. He lowered the rifle, then whispered, "If we're smart, we get out of here." The rational side of me agreed, but I felt anchored by shock. We needed to see if the hiker was still alive. Grant motioned for me to stay put while he inched closer to check a patch of disturbed grass. I crouched behind a cluster of saplings, knees wobbling. He shuffled around for a moment, then froze. His posture went rigid. I knew something terrible lay in front of him. He turned back, eyes wide, and made a quick gesture for me to move away. My gut twisted, and I forced myself to inch forward to see what he was looking at. A torn jacket, stained and reeking of copper, draped over a shape that did not move. My stomach flipped at the realization that the shape was a person's torso. The legs were missing, and the ground was soaked. Grant motioned for us to back off. Then, without warning, the undergrowth behind him rattled. A tall form rose from the brush, its face low and heavy-jawed, eyes sunken beneath thick ridges. Speckled patterns ran across its arms like patches of moss. I couldn't process how something that large moved so quietly. Grant swung the rifle up and fired. The blast punched the air, a deafening crack. I saw the muzzle flash, smelled the acrid sting of gunpowder. For a second, I thought the shot missed. Then that hunched figure stumbled and unleashed a wet, hiss-like roar that made me cringe. A second shot made it reel back, thrashing against the pine trunks, sending bark flying. I crawled backward until I found the strength to stand and bolt. I heard Grant's footsteps right behind me. We must have run several hundred yards before he slowed, panting, to reload. My lungs felt scorched. My mind spun with a single thought: this day was supposed to be about fishing, and now we were fleeing from a monstrous phantom that seemed beyond belief. We paused to gather ourselves, scanning the tree line. Nothing. For the first time, I realized my hands were coated in sticky debris, probably sap from the trees or something worse. We decided we had to reach a truck or any vehicle. The ranger station was closer than my car. Grant led the way, stepping over fallen logs. Every snap of a twig made my neck prickle. We made it to a wide service trail, and Grant muttered that the cabin was half a mile east. We started jogging again. I tried to lighten the mood by blurting, "Well, if we live through this, remind me to check the fish advisories." He laughed, a short, desperate sound, then sped up. We reached the station to find the door flung open, and inside was chaos. Desks overturned, radio set smashed, a coffee mug broken into shards. Grant rushed for the emergency cabinet, yanked it open, and grabbed flares. He handed me two, plus a small handheld radio he hoped might still work. We stepped outside, gazing around like we expected that towering shape to burst from the tree line at any second. Grant managed to get a static-laced response on the radio. He gave their location, demanded backup. The voice on the other end was garbled, but it sounded like they were dispatching help. We waited, but the minutes dragged, and no one arrived. We decided to walk to the nearest road intersection, figuring rescue teams would find us faster in open ground. With every step, the entire forest felt loaded with unseen eyes. Branches clacked overhead, pine needles crunched underfoot, and the breeze carried a sour scent I couldn't place. When we finally saw the road, relief flooded me. We spotted two black SUVs pulling up with their headlights on, and uniformed rangers jumped out. Grant tried explaining, voice shaking. The rangers looked skeptical until he showed them the scrapes on his arm and the dried smear on his vest. One of them radioed something about a possible wildlife attack. Grant and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we both knew no ordinary animal caused that carnage. They ushered us into an SUV. As we drove away, I peered out the back window, expecting to see that monstrous outline lurching through the trees, but there was only the shifting of branches. One of the rangers turned and asked if we needed medical attention. I just closed my eyes and said, "I've got enough new nightmares to keep me busy for a while." Grant exhaled and nodded in agreement. They dropped us off near the park entrance, where paramedics checked us. Apart from cuts and bruises, we seemed physically okay. Mentally, we were anything but. We gave stammering accounts of what we had witnessed, but nobody pressed us for more details. Possibly they'd heard too many bizarre stories from frantic visitors. Maybe they knew something roamed those woods that defied straightforward explanation. I left the park that same evening. The entire ordeal had lasted only one day, but it felt endless. When I turned the key in my ignition, my hands trembled. Grant parted with a hollow smile, promising we'd talk soon. We never did. I imagine he filed some discreet report, or maybe he kept quiet, fearing no one would believe him. I told myself I'd stay away from Yellowstone for the rest of my life. Part of me wonders if the place was always harboring hidden dangers, waiting for some poor soul to wander off trail. But I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I gripped the steering wheel, glanced over my shoulder at the tall trees, and drove on with my heart pounding. That was the last time I planned a quiet fishing trip to see wildlife. I had seen enough. I reached home that night, locked my door, and realized I couldn't shake the memory of those twisted marks in the dirt or that last glimpse of a wide, hunched shape. I stood in the silence of my living room, noticing how my hands still shook. The next day, I woke up early, stepped outside, and felt relief in the normal sights of my neighborhood. It was over, but I'd never be the same. I sat alone on my porch and let the sun warm my face. That's when I knew I wouldn't share this with anyone else, not because it wasn't real, but because some things should remain unwritten. I took a breath and gathered my courage, and then I went inside. I rushed behind the old pine as a sudden crash echoed through the pines. My heart pounded faster than I'd ever felt, and each breath seared my lungs. I had glimpsed a shape out there, tall and horrifying in a way I'd struggled to put into words. Its presence made the world shrink, as if I stood alone on an island of reason. Somehow backing away felt safe, but I was determined to unravel the secret behind those bizarre tracks. My name is Peter Morris, and this happened back in 2012 in the backcountry near the Madison River in Yellowstone National Park. I was there on a day trip, aiming to check out a secluded fishing spot I'd heard about from a ranger. I had a cheap spinning rod, a bag of tackle, and a cooler with water and sandwiches. The plan sounded simple: hike in, fish a little, hike out by sundown. Even if the hike felt a bit longer than I liked, I figured the payoff would be a few trout and an evening's worth of quiet. My buddy Neil came along. He was a wiry guy, full of nervous energy. I'm more reserved, but I liked how he could crack a joke in the face of any inconvenience. He spent half the walk complaining about the size of the mosquitoes and the other half making me laugh about the weird way bison stare when they spot tourists. We reached a bend in the trail that split off toward a dense patch of forest, which the ranger said led to a quiet stretch of the river. I noticed broken branches scattered along the ground, all snapped at about waist height. The cuts weren't neat, and some looked twisted in a way that made me uneasy. Neil tried to shrug it off, said maybe a moose had been thrashing around. Neither of us bought that for long. As we ventured deeper into the trees, the light changed in a weird way. The midday sun above Yellowstone usually felt bright and cheery, but here it filtered through the canopy in narrow beams that flickered whenever a breeze shook the pines. Shadows danced across our path. My shoes skidded on loose gravel, and once or twice, I nearly lost my balance on exposed roots that seemed to pop out at me. I felt a quiet tension I couldn't shake. Neil started whistling to pass the time, though his melody sounded off, like he was forcing a tune just to pretend we were comfortable. I spotted enormous impressions in the soft dirt. They almost looked like elongated, five-toed tracks spaced in strange intervals. Neil tried to step in one, just to get a sense of scale. His sneaker fit several times over. He forced a grin and said, "Maybe Bigfoot's cousin is up here." I tried to return the grin, but my face felt stiff. Even from a distance, I could smell an odd odor that reminded me of damp fur, as though a large, sweaty animal had passed through. We kept on until we found a clearing beside the river, the water running calm and wide. We set down our gear, and Neil made a few casts. I stood back, scanning the tree line. A chipmunk scurried past. A breeze rippled the surface of the water. For a moment, I thought everything might be normal. Then Neil gave me an elbow jab, nodding toward the opposite bank. About 50 yards away, branches swayed wildly, as if a giant was trampling the undergrowth. I heard a sharp, resonant screech that made my skin prickle. Neil reeled in slowly, eyes locked on the shifting branches. We waited, bracing for a glimpse of a bison or maybe a bear. But what emerged was no bear. Its broad shoulders made me think of a hunched bull, except it stood on two powerful legs. The arms were long, clinging to the branches like a giant ape might, though its torso didn't match any ape I'd ever seen in books or on TV. A thick line of dark hair covered its chest and arms, but large patches of naked, leathery skin ran along its flanks. Its head had a flattened snout and upward-pointing ears that looked ragged at the edges, as if they'd been torn and healed badly. A strong jaw tapered into a mouth with wide, blocky teeth. Its eyes gleamed in the filtered sunlight, and they seemed fixed on us with a smart, almost human curiosity. Neil whispered, "Let's get out of here." We edged backward, making sure not to splash too much in the water. I could barely breathe as I watched the thing tilt its head, sniffing the air. Then it bounded up the bank, smashing saplings underfoot with unnerving force. Neil and I didn't say a word. We just ran for the trail, fishing gear forgotten. My chest burned with the effort, and the forest sped by in green and brown blurs. A spasm of noise erupted behind us, a bellow that tore through the quiet. Neil glanced over his shoulder mid-stride and lost his footing. He hit the ground with a grunt, dropping his rod. I grabbed his arm, but before I could yank him up, that towering figure crashed into view. It seized Neil's pack, flinging him sideways. The straps snapped, and Neil tumbled against a fallen log. Pain showed on his face. I scrambled to pull him up, heart pounding so loud I barely heard him shout. "We hobbled forward, each step seeming slower than the last. Neil's face went white, and he pointed past my shoulder. The silhouette moved around us in a wide arc, circling with measured caution. It made a throaty hiss, and I saw dark lines along its jaw, as though it had once torn through hide or flesh and never fully cleaned itself. In a blink, it charged. I shoved Neil aside and dove in the opposite direction. Branches whipped my arms as I rolled down a shallow embankment. I heard Neil cursing, and then I heard a solid crunch behind me. I crawled up the slope and found Neil pinned. The monstrous shape was looming over him, its arm pressed to his chest. Its face was so close I could see watery eyes blinking in rapid succession. Neil, in a panic, swung an elbow and caught its chin. It staggered but didn't move away, just reared back and let out another bellow that rattled my teeth. I dropped my cooler on purpose, hoping to distract it with clattering plastic. It whipped its head toward me, teeth bared behind those thick lips. Neil seized that moment to scramble free. We bolted downhill, veering off the trail to confuse it. The pines rose tall, trunk after trunk, as though they offered some meager shelter. Neil led us toward a cluster of boulders near the water, panting too hard to speak. I heard snapping timber behind us, but for a minute, the shape didn't appear. We ducked behind a large rock, both of us sucking wind and trying not to groan out loud. Neil winced, holding his ribs. I noticed faint smears on his shirt, dark and wet, but I resisted looking too closely. He forced a shaky laugh that sounded more like relief. "I'd give anything to swap places with a bored tourist right now," he said in a breathless murmur. We heard rustling. I peeked over the boulder in time to see that shape prowling near the riverbank, scanning the tree line as though searching for us. It moved with a weird intelligence, pacing in slow arcs, letting out short, rasping snorts. I remembered the snapped branches we'd seen earlier and realized it had probably stalked the area for a while. It had no fear of the wilderness or of us. I felt cornered, yet I knew we had only one chance: circle around and make for the main trail, hoping to reach the ranger station. I motioned for Neil to stay low. Step by step, we edged away from the boulders, creeping behind the trunk of a massive pine. My back brushed its rough bark, and bits of loose moss clung to my shirt. The shape snorted again, perhaps catching our scent. Neil raised a finger to his lips in a silent plea for me to stay quiet. I tried not to breathe too loud. We broke into a run the second it turned away. The undergrowth whipped our legs, leaving small cuts and stinging welts. Twice, I nearly tumbled. Neil was struggling to keep pace. I grabbed his arm around my shoulder, helping him push forward. We crossed a shallow stream, water sloshing around our ankles. Then we saw a sign for the main trail, pointing left. We followed the arrow. The panic in my chest started to recede when I recognized familiar ground. The ranger station should have been about a half-mile ahead. I no longer heard that hissing bellow, but I refused to let up on the speed. When the roof of the wooden station finally came into view, my knees almost gave out from relief. We burst inside, startling the Lone Ranger on duty. He jumped up from his chair, saw our expressions, and reached for the radio. Neil collapsed into a seat, breath ragged. I stammered something about a vicious animal in the forest. The ranger, wearing a skeptical look, asked if we had pictures. Neil just laughed, then coughed in pain. I offered a hushed explanation, but my words tumbled out so fast I hardly made sense. Another ranger arrived, saw Neil's torn clothing, and started a first aid check. They radioed for backup. I sat on the floor, tried to steady my breathing, and realized we'd left almost all our gear behind. Neil gave me a thin grin and mumbled about how this was the worst fishing trip of his life. The rangers debated whether to send a team out to investigate or wait until morning, but the urgency in my voice finally convinced them to send a patrol right then. I tried to describe the shape as calmly as possible. A tall figure, muscular limbs, ragged ears, black hair with patches of bare hide. It moved on two legs, strong enough to snap small trees. One ranger joked about us seeing Sasquatch's angry cousin. I felt no humor in it, but Neil let out a feeble chuckle. The official search later turned up disturbed soil and more of those impossible footprints, but not much else. Some hikers claimed to catch fleeting glimpses of a large, agile silhouette among the pines, though no one could pin down its exact nature. I stayed at the station until they brought in a car to drive us out. Neil needed a hospital visit. I needed a stiff drink. By the time we reached the park exit, the sun was going down, casting long shadows across the roads and fields. My shirt was still damp from crossing that stream, and the day felt like it had lasted a lifetime. I looked at Neil and realized I'd be grateful for his jokes any time he wanted to tell them. Even in a place as open and famous as Yellowstone, we discovered a hidden corner of raw terror that probably wouldn't make it into any travel brochure. As I stepped out of the car, I caught a final glimpse of the darkening tree line in the distance and felt one thought running through my mind: I was just glad we made it out together.